presented by GMG EnviroSafe. I'm Melissa Joles with Impact Collision Solutions, and Brandon Thomas, Chief Operating Officer for GMG EnviroSafe, is your presenter for this webinar. The presentation will take approximately 40 to 45 minutes, and we are recording it, and we'll post it on the website under the training videos. If you have any questions, you can type them in the chat box at the bottom right of your screen, and Brandon will answer them at the end of the presentation. Now I'm going to turn it over to Brandon. Brandon.
Thanks, Melissa. I appreciate the opportunity to get in front of you guys and talk to you about this program. We've got a lot of ground to cover, so I'm going to jump right into it. Melissa already was kind enough to introduce me. As she said, my name is Brandon Thomas. I work with GMG EnviroSafe. I come from a shop background. I worked for a consolidator in Chicago, Collision Revision. We have 30 shops in Illinois and Indiana, so I used to be on the shop side dealing with these issues, and can speak to that and will throughout the presentation. GMG EnviroSafe, we've been doing EPA, OSHA, DOT compliance specific to the collision industry now for over 20 years, and we service the entire country. We have business as far out as Alaska and Hawaii. We're trying to tackle these issues in every single state in the United States. So why are we talking about OSHA? Why is that a focus area? And really that's tied to an isocyanate emphasis program that was announced by OSHA at a federal level last year in June of 2013. And what they announced is that they were going to be focusing their inspection activity on specific industries in the United States that have isocyanate exposures for their workers. They're going to be doing that for a 3-year period, so we've already finished year 1, and we've got 2 years left. And what they're trying to do is understand how businesses and industries are protecting their workers from isocyanates, and whether or not they need to strengthen protections and regulations that are already in place. This is going to serve their overall mission as an organization, as an agency, which is to reduce occupational illness and death. So before we dive into the enforcement world of OSHA with these isocyanates, let's talk about the chemicals themselves very briefly. So these are highly reactive. There are dozens of isocyanates. These are not tied to one individual chemical. They've been linked to respiratory disease for over 60 years in American workers. And I've seen some misconceptions out there that they cause cancer in humans, and that is not the case. There are just potential links. There has been no study that has tied isocyanates as causing cancer in humans. What we do have is these chemicals have caused cancer in animals such as lab rats and mice. So why does OSHA care? Well, isocyanates are powerful irritants to 2 bodily systems. One being the respiratory tract, and you see on the left column on the screen some long-term illnesses such as asthma, bronchospasms, bronchitis, that sort of thing. The other bodily system is mucous membranes, and you see the symptoms there that look and feel sort of like an allergic reaction. For anyone that's on the call that's been participating in this industry for 10, 15, 20 years, I would be surprised if you didn't have a colleague, a coworker, somebody that you knew from the industry that hasn't developed some type of an allergic reaction where if they go into a paint shop or a body shop, they have some type of rash, or they start to have coughing fits, or they itch. What that is an isocyanate sensitization that they've developed. Think of it just the same way that you would think of a dog allergy or a pollen allergy. And OSHA's concern is twofold here. One, the sensitization can develop with very low levels of exposure over a period of time. So when we look at painters in a body shop that maybe are very good about wearing respiratory protection and other PPE when they're spraying, but they're not wearing anything when they're mixing or when they're cleaning their guns, that's a low level of exposure that happens every single day. Or a painter that maybe is on a 2-week respirator change-out schedule, and they let it slide for a couple days, or they wait 3 weeks. Well, there's another low level of exposure that's happening day in and day out. So over time, those low levels of exposure of isocyanates that are coming throughout the painter's career, or anyone that's working in the shop that's exposed to these chemicals, their body can develop a threshold where they have this sensitization, where now repeated exposures triggers that physical response, whether that be rashes, hives, itching, coughing, that sort of thing. The second concern that OSHA has with isocyanate sensitization is that these are water-insoluble chemicals, which means it's very difficult to wash off of skin or clothing. If you get paint on your hands or oil on your hands, you can wash it off with a granulated soap or some type of hand cleaner, and you're relatively safe. No damage is done. With these isocyanates, they don't come off your skin or clothing very easily, so just washing your hands doesn't necessarily remove the hazard of repeated isocyanate exposure. So from OSHA's perspective, if you've got something that can cause long-term health issues at a low level of exposure and you can't really react when it happens, prevention is the key step. They want to see businesses and industries that prevent exposure to isocyanates in the first place so that you eliminate the health hazard. In a body shop environment, prevention is really booths, prep station, ventilation, personal protective equipment, training, and we'll get into some of that here in a little bit. So in a body shop environment, we're talking predominantly clear coats. However, there are major paint manufacturers where isocyanates are found in primers, base coats, sealers. A lot of times you'll see them in hardeners, catalyzers, activators, that sort of thing. Hexamethylene and isoflurane are the two most common isocyanates in the shop. However, there's probably about a dozen different isocyanates that you can come across depending on the types of products that you're using. From an exposure point, a repair operation, you're looking at mixing, spraying, and gun cleaning. A lot of individuals don't think of gun cleaning as an opportunity to be exposed to isocyanates, but it does occur. In the body department, sanding and grinding can reintroduce or re-atomize isocyanates where they can be breathed in. And then finally, contact with an uncured contaminated surfaces. So what that means, isocyanates, once the chemical reaction has completed itself, once it's had an opportunity to cure, they're safe to handle. You could put your hand on the side of a vehicle and you're not risking any type of isocyanate exposure once it's completely cured. So when we're talking the health hazard, it's with the liquid uncured paint. So if we're cleaning our gun, we've got liquid uncured paint that's inside of a chamber, or if you go into a mix room and you have liquid uncured paint that's maybe on the door handle or the garbage can or the mixing scale or a workbench or a can of toner. All of those surfaces now have been contaminated with those isocyanates to where other people that are handling those surfaces, if they're not wearing gloves, can have that exposure as well. Some of the misconceptions that I hear when I talk to staff around the country is I'm safe if I can't smell or taste the chemical, I don't feel dizzy, I don't feel lightheaded. And although that's a safe rule of thumb for some chemicals, it doesn't work in isocyanates. Isocyanates are odorless. They don't have a taste to them. They don't cause dizziness. They don't cause lightheadedness. A few isocyanates have a smell. It's kind of fruity and pungent. But if you can smell that, you are way, way beyond the allowable threshold, and you're in a bad spot to where you're posing a health hazard to yourself. So those types of triggers aren't going to work for isocyanate protection. The other thing that I hear from painters specifically is, hey, the paint is ending up on the panel. I don't come out of the booth and I'm covered in paint. So the hazardous chemicals, the things that I have to be worried about that are in these coatings, they're ending up on the panel as well or into the floor filter if it's a downdraft booth. The idea is this is kind of the airflow that they've imagined in their head in a downdraft environment. So if you will picture a vehicle right in the middle there, and the air is believed to be just kind of wrapping or enveloping around the vehicle, the paint stays on the panel, and any overspray, chemicals, that sort of thing, gets sucked down into the pits or the floor filters. Well, isocyanates, when they're released from a coating, are a very fine, invisible mist. And what we actually see is this mist of isocyanates is caught up in an air vortex that stays on the side of the vehicle where the painters are going to spend most of their time when they're in the booth. The reason for that, again, if you can picture a vehicle here in the middle, is that you have air movement coming north and south, and then air movement coming east and west out of the HVLP gun. That air gets hit up against the panels of the vehicle that are being painted, and it just swirls and swirls and swirls the entire time someone is in that booth using their gun. When you actually look at clearance times for these isocyanates in a booth, the average is 4 to 6 minutes from when they stop spraying. So if I'm a painter and I'm in this environment and I spray and I finish and I walk out, change, and I come back in to get something that I may have left, there could still be isocyanates lingering in this vortex for up to 6 minutes to where it's an unsafe environment to be in. And when we look at painters' PPE, this gentleman is obviously illustrating something, is not a very good example. But when we have painters, especially in warmer climates, that are wearing respiratory protection, but they're not wearing gloves, they're not wearing any type of skin protection like a coverall, the entire time they're standing there, they're being exposed repeatedly to those isocyanates that can be absorbed through the mucous membranes or through your skin. So when we look at enforcement specifically, collision repair has been confirmed by OSHA as a primary target for this program. And remember, it's a 3-year window, and they are randomizing selection. So what OSHA has said is that any business that has filed a tax return as a collision repair, which is 7532 SIC code, if they have 1 or more employees, they're going into a list. They get a sequential number, and then they're pulled at random. And what we're finding is that the federal level of OSHA has made a quota where each industry, so collision repair being one, has to go through a certain number of inspections for this program every single year. And so parts of the country that normally really don't have a lot of OSHA oversight, or businesses haven't been exposed to inspections previously, are now being blindsided by this because of these quotas where these area offices have to do inspections in their area in order to meet the federal mandate. Whenever I do this presentation to a group, I typically get the question, why is this a concern now? Why is it, I mean, isocyanates have been a part of the process for decades. Why suddenly is OSHA concerned about this? And the best way that I can answer that is OSHA's counterpart in the Great Britain had done a study looking at painters in a body shop environment asthma rates and comparing that with other industrial workers. And I'll give you the answer here because I can't, you guys are all muted, but the answer to this is painters in body shops have 80 times the risk of occupational asthma compared to other industrial workers. And OSHA's concern is they're really not confident with where these different industries are at in terms of the precautions and the safety measures that have been taking place with isocyanates. So they're using this 3-year window to go out and assess it. You know, are we doing enough? Do we need to do more? Because this type of an environment, you have a very high level of risk compared to other workers when it comes to occupational asthma. So I want to spend some time talking about what an actual audit looks like. The typical OSHA audit is going to be very different than an audit that's tied to an isocyanate program. What we're hearing out there around the country is that these are taking anywhere from 4 or 5 business days to 15 or 16 business days, depending on what they find when they come out to the facility. And they're stretching over 30 and 60-day periods, where OSHA might come out for a couple of days, and then they'll leave for a few weeks, and then they'll come back for a couple of days. Very disruptive to the business, very unsettling for the technicians that are trying to work. What's going to happen is they're going to start with a conference with ownership. They're going to want to see every chemical that's in the shop, some type of inventory, all the safety data sheets that go along with it. Let's talk about your personal protective equipment processes, the training. What are you using? What kind of assessment have you done as an owner? They'll dive into record keeping that's tied to occupational health and injuries. So they're going to look at OSHA 300 logs for 5 years. This is where the business owner should have been keeping track of who got hurt or who got sick. They may look at medical records of the employees, and they're going to meet and talk with the employees to find out what kind of personal protective equipment are they using when they're working or in the work area. So a painter, they're going to specifically want to know what are you wearing as PPE when you're spraying, when you're mixing, when you're buffing, when you're sanding primer, when you're masking a vehicle. They're also going to look at symptoms. So they have an entire grid with coughing and wheezing and stuffiness and that sort of thing. And what they're going to do is they're going to ask the employees, do you ever experience these on a day-to-day basis? And do they get better if you go on vacation? Because they're trying to identify maybe one of your employees is under the impression that they just have a cough. That's just kind of a health thing that they have. And the reality is they have an undiagnosed occupational illness tied to this isocyanate exposure. Once they're finished with the office work, they're going to spend time in the shop. They're going to look at what you have in terms of equipment, personal protective equipment. They'll conduct air and wipe sampling. The wipe sampling is a bit new. Remember, we were talking about uncured contaminated surfaces. So if I'm a painter that sprayed a vehicle or cleaned my gun and I take a break and I have these isocyanates on my hands and I go to the break room and I open the door, I open the refrigerator, I grab my lunch, I pour myself a cup of coffee, and I grab the television remote and turn on Judge Judy or something like that. it's possible those isocyanates have now contaminated every single one of those surfaces. And then your receptionist, your bookkeeper, your estimator, someone that's not exposed to these chemicals or shouldn't be exposed to them, walks into that same break room. Are they being exposed to something that they don't even know exists? Key thing, don't be limited to think, oh, it's isocyanates, I only have to worry about that. Once OSHA has come into the body department, mechanical wash, paperwork, it does not matter. Some of the areas that they're actively encouraged to go are looking at flammable combustible products and general housekeeping. Once you've been through this inspection, you're subject to follow-up inspections of up to 2 years. It depends on how you do. If the shop does very poorly, they're going to have more scrutiny. If they do very well, it may be something that's just communicated in writing, which is what's known as a hazard alert letter, or a HAL. Essentially, OSHA is going to stay involved in the business until there's documentation that everything has been corrected and employees are no longer exposed to isocyanates above the allowable limits. So what we're seeing is that, the catalyst for these inspections is this isocyanate emphasis program around the country. So shops should be prepared both for the isocyanates as well as kind of the top 5 concerns when it comes to shop violations. We're going to dive into each of these. So the first is respiratory protection. Respiratory protection has alternated between the #1 citation for body shops and the #2 citation for probably the last 12 or 13 years, as long as we have data. There's a couple of different ways that a shop can have a serious citation tied to a respiratory program. The first is whether or not they even have a written program. And the best way I can explain that is if the shop does not have something in writing, a business plan, that talks about respirators, talks about training, talks about when it has to be used, how it has to be maintained, what the training requirements are, that's a serious violation. They have to have these things documented. One step further than that, anyone that's wearing a respirator must have gone through some type of a medical evaluation. They have to have clearance from a medical professional to be able to wear it. Then they have to go through annual respirator training, an annual fit test. The shop should have completed an air monitoring analysis to determine what kind of respirator needs to be used, what kind of change-out schedule it has to be on. The air monitoring is the monitor or the clip that a painter will wear for an entire day that gets sent into a lab and tested. And then there has to be documentation of when the respirator cartridges are changed. Is it every 2 weeks? Is it every 4 weeks? Whatever that is, based on the monitoring results, there has to be documentation that shows that the business is fulfilling that requirement. #2 citation, and this is the one that has alternated with respiratory protection for the last 10 or so years, is hazard communication. So respiratory protection and hazard communication have been #1 and #2 by a long shot in the collision repair industry for an extended period of time. And again, hazard communication is essentially you have hazards that are tied to working, where somebody can get hurt or they can be exposed to chemicals that are harmful to them. You have to have a business plan for how to deal with it. What are the emergency evacuation procedures? What are the handling procedures? How are you labeling containers? Where do you find the safety data sheets? All of those things have to be documented on top of what's known as a hazard assessment, which is #4 on that list there, which is essentially, as the business owner, you're evaluating all the different ways somebody can be hurt. So if I have a body person that's doing sanding, the hazard would be they might get dust in their eyes. Therefore, as a business, we're going to require safety glasses whenever they're dusting so that they don't have the risk of getting something in their eye, or it's mitigated. It's a lot lower than if they weren't wearing safety glasses. That's kind of what we're talking about when we say hazard communication, hazard assessment. You have to have a list of all the chemicals in the shop. They have to have corresponding SDS, safety data sheets. And then you have to do annual training with your technicians or anyone that's around these chemicals to make sure that they're comfortable with what they're seeing. #3, spray finishing. A lot of variability with how this can be enforced from an OSHA standpoint. The most common is going to be tied to personal protective equipment. So someone that is spraying a coating and they're not wearing glasses, they're not wearing gloves, they don't have a respiratory protection on at all, whether that's fresh air, a PAPR, or a half-face piece respirator. Everything is kind of wrapped up in that. So depending on what OSHA is observing, there could be a citation tied to any one of those categories. What we've also seen is that the disposable coverall or a chute suit that a painter might be using is the wrong one. Not a lot of people are aware that the chute suits or the coveralls are supposed to provide protection for isocyanates, that it's not supposed to be used just to keep your clothing clean. And so there's been shops that have been fined and issued penalties from OSHA because they're wearing a suit or a coverall that doesn't protect from isocyanates. So it's very important for jobbers, distributors, the shops to re-engage with whatever it is that they're buying and just making sure that they're getting the suit that protects against the chemical exposure and isn't just any suit that they throw on. Booth and mix room, the equipment itself, you could have flammables inside. You might have a very poor condition equipment where air is escaping or chemicals are escaping. Believe it or not, we still see smoking in the mix rooms. We still see smoking in the booths. That's actually something that comes up relatively frequently around the country. So all of those things would be a serious citation. Overall hygiene, a good example of that would be if a painter has a full beard and they're trying to wear a respirator over the top of it. It's really not doing them any good. That would be a citation to the business. And then finally, nearby employees. I'm going to talk a little bit further on that, so I'll table that. We're going to spend some time here in about 10 minutes talking about that one specifically. The number 4 is flammables. Grounding cables are required when you've got a metal container that has flammable liquid inside of it, if it's 5 gallons or more. So specifically in the body shop environment, typically what we see is a 5-gallon container of virgin thinner, maybe bigger. It's in a metal container, metal drum, and has a pump attached to it. That has to be grounded, and there's a picture there of what a grounding cable looks like. Or a 55-gallon metal drum of solvent waste, liquid paint waste mixed in with waste thinner. That is a flammable liquid. It's in a metal container. It's a larger quantity. That also has to be grounded. Sometimes shops get fined for having the wrong container. When you're dealing with Class 1, Class 2 flammables like thinner, solvent-based paints, that sort of thing, it can't just go into a plastic container for the most part. There are exceptions around the country with a few states, but for the most part it has to be a metal container. In fact, the OSHA gets even as specific as when you have flammables in the area, you have to have no smoking signs. They even regulate how big the lettering has to be and the type of colors that have to be used. So they get very, very nitpicky with the shops when it comes to flammable liquids and containers. Extinguishers, mounted, accessible. You're not obstructing it with somebody's coat or a parts cart or a box from a fender or something like that. The annual training that has to be done on these chemicals. And then the 5th one on that list, near ignition sources. What we've seen is, for example, a 55-gallon drum of solvent paint waste sitting underneath an electrical panel or a light fixture that's very close to it, or a surge protector that has a radio and an air conditioning fan plugged in, that sort of thing. So if these flammable liquids in the mix room or in waste storage are being kept in a place where it's near something that could create a spark or combust, that would be a serious citation as well. Last but not least, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. This is the wiring and general equipment. This is kind of the catch-all for OSHA. So it's pretty straightforward. A ground fault protection in your wash bays, electrical panels that are labeled and unobstructed, cords that don't have frayed wiring. If there's a 3-prong plug, the guys haven't pulled off the ground off of that plug to make it a 2-prong. And then permanent wiring, flexible cords cannot be used in place of permanent wiring. And the best way to tell that is when you have a shop that has zip-tied a 40-foot or 50-foot electrical cord to the ceiling to get power into another part of the shop. Well, it's zip-tied in the ceiling. That is essentially permanent wiring, and you're using a flexible cord. That would be an OSHA citation. So when we're looking at the collision industry, serious citations, I'm not being facetious there by putting it in quotes, that's a defined term within OSHA. When we look at average cost historically for just the collision industry, we're talking about $5,000. Now, that is per citation, per serious citation. So don't think if OSHA visits a shop, the damage is limited to $5,000. When we look at data across the entire country and OSHA inspections in the collision industry, the average number of citations when OSHA visits a shop, and they do issue a citation, is 4.77 citations per visit or inspection. So we're talking about, if they're serious, $5,000 times 4 to 5 citations, you're talking $20,000 to $25,000 could be the potential damage. This isn't necessarily what a shop pays. You know, this is always a negotiation. This is always something that can be contested and brought to court, that sort of thing. But this is typically the starting point or the average that we've seen in collision repair. As a quick review, I get a lot of questions in terms of, well, I have less than 10 employees, or I'm spraying water. Is there any way to get me out of this program? And the quick answer is no. There is no way that you can be exempt from an OSHA inspection tied to this isocyanate program. It is one or more employees. Water-based paint does not address the solvents that are in catalyzers, hardeners, primers, and clear coats. Exempt from 6H NESHAP, this was the regulation from the EPA 5 years ago dealing with emissions and hazardous air pollutants. So that doesn't apply to OSHA. In fact, I want to talk about this. Previously, I brought up spraying near other employees. And we have a scenario now where you can be doing something that is compliant with EPA but a violation for OSHA, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So EPA NESHAP 6H, just to kind of refresh your memory, this was the 3-ounce cup rule, and it dealt with air emissions and specific pollutants that can be found in coatings. So if I am a shop that is doing everything right on the shop floor from an EPA standpoint, I could be spraying with a 3-ounce cup of primer or base or whatever it is that I'm using, and everything is fine. If EPA walks in, they pat me on the back, and everything is good. 3-ounce cup, my paperwork is done, I'm using the right gun, everything is great. However, if those products in the same environment have isocyanates in them, and OSHA were to walk in the door, you could be staring down a very serious citation. The reason for that is, again, we're looking at this fine mist. And when you spray for 1 second on the shop floor, those isocyanates are traveling between 3 and 5 feet from the gun. Within 2 seconds, we're now anywhere from 10 to 13 feet. 4 seconds, we're all the way to 20 feet away those isocyanates have traveled. Now, a typical panel, 3-ounce cup, let's say you're spraying for 30 seconds, maybe 40. Where have those isocyanates traveled in 30 seconds if in 4 they're 20 feet away? The answer is they're throughout the entire shop. So we have issues in certain parts of the country where inspections have occurred where a shop is doing everything right from an emission EPA environmental standpoint with a 3-ounce cup on the shop floor, but they've been fined because they have employees that are nearby someone is spraying, let's say a helper that's masking off the next car, or a teardown technician that's getting ready for blueprinting or something like that. And they're being exposed to isocyanates because this painter that's on the shop floor is releasing them into the air, and it's basically going throughout the entire shop. So it's very important that the shops spend some time reevaluating the processes to identify, is what I'm spraying on the shop floor, does it have isocyanates, and am I putting other employees at risk, and are they wearing the right personal protective equipment? I want to change gears just as a refresher because this is the other OSHA regulation enforcement thing that's going on. This is tied to that big hazard communication standard that seems to be the #1 or #2 violation across the country every single year. They revised this standard in 2012. It's not a new regulation. It just basically changed a few things with labeling and your data sheets. I'm sure you guys are all ringing a bell now. The reason why I want to talk about it is not a lot of shops are aware that they had a training deadline in December of last year where they had to have trained all of their employees on what's coming over the next couple of years. You'll see some other dates dealing with manufacturers and jobbers and that sort of thing, and something else that the employer has to do, meaning the body shop, in June of 2016. But the big concern is, did the shops get the training done December of last year? So there's no more M. Safety data sheets are now SDS instead of MSDS. There's additional information in the sheets themselves. They've standardized some of the language. The pictograms are now standardized, so this is 6 of the most common in a body shop environment out of the 9. You'll see that they're all diamonds, red bordered, white background, black image. So those are going to be on the labels. The shops should have done the training as of December 1st, and they should have also designated someone in the shop to be the library manager. Because as the chemical classification process has changed, things that we all knew and loved in a body shop under previous hazard communication rules from OSHA now may be classified as a different hazard. So someone has to be responsible at the shop for when the job or distributor sends you the product and sends the data sheet, the new safety data sheet with it that's coming here over the next 2 years. They have to review that and compare it with the old MSDS to determine, do I have a new chemical hazard? Do I have to re-communicate and retrain to my employees? There has to be a process there. The training that has to be covered, the pictograms themselves, the labeling, the content of each section that's in a safety data sheet, there's 16 of them, the relationship between a label and an SDS, what happens if there's more than one warning. You know, a thinner is an irritant, it's a health hazard because it has carcinogenic properties, it's flammable, so you're going to have multiple pictograms. If I'm a technician, what does that mean? So the shops should have some type of documentation in terms of who attended the training, the date that it occurred, who instructed the training, you know, with sign-off sheets and that sort of thing, and then what was covered. That's the really only way to protect the business from having some type of issue with OSHA when it comes to this program. That wraps up the actual OSHA component of the presentation. I want to change gears briefly and just talk about what our value proposition is to RDA IMPACT and its membership. So very briefly, what we do is essentially we're an outsourcing solution. We are not consultants. Our people all come from a shop environment around the country. We understand the collision business. We look to set up a compliance department within the shop. Similar to how it has a refinish department, an estimating department, we want to staff and set up a compliance department that deals with risk management, OSHA, EPA, DOT matters. The value to the business is it's going to save them money, both in terms of workman's comp premiums, injuries, training programs that they're already doing, time investment to learn these things, and then, of course, the potential for citations. It's going to reduce the risk for injury, liability, that sort of thing, demonstrate concern for their employees' well-being as well as their community and environment. The big thing for me, being a former shop, not owner, but essentially an employee of a large organization in Chicago where we had multiple shops, is the expertise. It's very difficult to learn about all the different regulations that are coming together. This is just scratching the surface. That's a huge time investment for a shop owner to have to do that. It's a lot of training they have to go through where they can get that very quickly, simplify their business, and focus on taking care of customers, taking care of cars. So what does that actually look like when we're talking about the compliance department? This is one of our most popular programs. I would say probably 75 to 80% of our customers across the country are participating in what this looks like. This is where we come out to the shops quarterly and do a comprehensive audit as if we were OSHA, EPA, DOT, as well as the local fire department and wastewater treatment facilities. You know, we're going to look at everything, both from a paperwork, personal protective equipment, behavior, fire safety, how waste is being handled. We do an annual in-person training class that meets the requirements both for OSHA, for the hazard communication, the respiratory protection, as well as certain DRP programs that have training requirements a part of them. We build a website that's customized just for these currently MSDS, but about to be phased out SDS that we manage to make sure all the updates are posted and done so that you no longer need those binders. We develop all the business plans, handle new employee orientation, the NESHAP 6H we talked about. The big thing for me is also we set all this up at the shop. We set up a filing system and that we manage. But if somebody needed to produce something, they know where it is. They know where they can find it. We train them on it. Any ongoing permits, licenses that are required by the state, the county, the city, we handle for them. If there was an audit, we'll work with the auditor. We'll do inspection assistance. We'll do mitigation, responses, action plans, things like that can be done. And then when it's work comp renewal time, we'll talk with an underwriter or a broker to help explain how the business is being proactive to control its risk and prevent injuries. So all of this, there's also some little things, but those are kind of the highlights. This type of a quarterly program through RDA and IMPACT and its membership, we offer for $199 a month. That's anywhere in the country. We're currently servicing nearly every state and have people situated around the country that we can be able to get to. That is without any type of enrollment fees. So it's not $199 a month, and oh, by the way, you got to spend $10,000 to participate. There are no enrollment fees for any of your customers or members. So you would be able to get somebody going right out of the gate where we get started with them at a $200 monthly rate. A lot of people ask me about what kind of contract do we have. We only have a 1-year contract. The reason for that is we purchase the flights in advance to control our costs as well as hotel accommodations, that sort of thing. So we just ask that you commit to us for a year so that we're not out the travel expenses if you were to cancel down the road. But just a 1-year contract for $199 a month. Melissa, that is all I have. If you want to open up to questions, feel free to jump in.
Okay. If anybody has questions, you can type them in the chat box, and I'll be happy to give them to Brandon. If not, I will be sending you Brandon's information. So if you have questions, you can go ahead and email him with that. And while we're waiting for questions, I do want to thank everybody. You gave us suggestions on future webinars, and we really appreciate that. And we'll do our best to make this training available and be in touch to let you know when it is available. But I'm not seeing any questions. You must have done such a thorough job. Nobody has any.
Well, everybody's asleep on me. That's always a risk when you're talking about OSHA.
I did a great job. Oh, wait. Here's a question. Let's see. Read it for you here. Okay. Let's see. I'm trying to make this. If the shop is the shop responsible for making employees wear PPE equipment or just making PPE available?
The shop is responsible for making employees wear PPE. It is not enough just to say, hey, if you want to wear a coverall or a chute suit, or if you want to wear nitrile gloves, here they are in the cabinet or the parts room, go ahead and do it. No, OSHA, it is the ownership or management's responsibility to have a disciplinary policy, to be enforcing that disciplinary policy where technicians are being written up, both verbally and then progressing into a write-up and then possibly termination if they're not wearing our safety equipment. We've actually had shops that have been cited and received penalties where they had a disciplinary policy, they had a nice thing that they had typed up, but in 5 years they had never actually done anything with it. They had never written a single employee up, and when OSHA walked in, there wasn't anyone wearing any type of PPE. So when the manager blamed it on the employees, that didn't fly because they didn't have a track record of documenting those things.
Okay, I have another question for you.
Okay.
Does OSHA allow an opportunity to correct violation before the fines?
It depends. So I compare it to being pulled over by the police when you're driving in your vehicle. It really depends on the personality of the inspector that you get. Some individuals will allow you to correct things while they're there, and if they're corrected before they leave, they'll note that in the report, and they won't issue a dollar amount penalty. They might put it in the report that you received a citation, but they don't actually penalize you monetarily. Other inspectors, once they see it, it's going on the report, and a dollar amount is associated with it. So it really just depends on where you are in the country and the type of citation that they're seeing. If it's something that's very, very dangerous, they're probably not going to look the other way on that. If it's something minor, like you just need to correct something very quickly, you can do that. But ultimately, it depends on how is that person's personality, and did they wake up feeling in a good mood or a bad mood, because it's entirely subjective to the inspector.
Okay. Another question. What is the OSHA in-person training class, annual training class? Not sure.
So we talked previously about that. So OSHA has a couple different requirements as it relates to the training that has to be done. Respiratory protection is the big one, and then hazard communication is the other one. Hazard communication, what that is what kind of chemicals are in the shop, where are they located, if I'm going to be working with them. For example, if I'm a body man and I'm using fillers and putties and glaze and oils and that sort of thing, what type of chemicals are those? What's in there? What's the risk? Do they cause cancer? What kind of precautions do I have to take in order to make sure that I'm not going to get sick or have an injury later on down the road? So hazard communication and the respiratory protection are the two big ones. Depending on where you're at in the country, we also see emergency evacuation procedures that have to be trained annually. We see fire extinguisher use that has to be trained annually. There's a couple different components that could be in, but those are the two big ones.
Okay, another question. Are there products in the body department, such as filler or adhesives, that contain the isocyanates?
Not to my knowledge, but where we see it in the body department is when you are sanding a panel in the body department, and let's say you're sanding something that was previously refinished from a previous repair. or if the actual coatings from the OE finish could have isocyanates in it as well. So you run into when they're sanding, let's say they've applied some type of a Bondo or filler to an area, and they start to feather edge around the dent, and they start to kick up that OE dust that's around there. You could have isocyanates that are introduced into the air at that point that could be breathed in. A lot of confusion is on what kind of mask does a body man need to wear, or a body technician. Typically you see those paper medical type masks. And for the most part, you actually need some type of cartridge-based respirator because of the chemicals they're exposed to, the isocyanates, when they're welding, that sort of thing. You actually need something that's more similar to the paint department than just a paper mask.
Okay. Any other questions? Oh, here we go. Do you need hard copies of MSD sheets, or are the copies on the computer good enough?
So a couple things here. One, OSHA has come out and provided documentation that says that electronic copies are acceptable, whether that's online or a fax service. However, you can have a local fire department that still wants to see a binder with everything printed. So you'd have to check with your area to determine if that's the case. If the fire department does not care, they don't have that requirement, then electronic copies are acceptable. However, I will caution the shops. Just saying on the computer is not enough. If you're working with a paint manufacturer, and every major paint manufacturer has their products online to where you can find them, well, you have more chemicals than that are in your shop. Thinners, fillers, seam sealers, foams, adhesives. You can't just say, well, most of my products are on the manufacturer's website, so if we need it, we go there. You actually have to have it organized, specific to your business, all the current data sheets online or on a fax service that are accessible, and you have to be able to produce a list that says this is what's there, this is what's in my shop. And then if I was to talk to one of your technicians, we've also seen citations issued where the shop has everything right, but they never told the employees where it was. So when I have an interview with a body technician, I say, hey, where do you get the data sheets? The body technician will say, oh, it's in a binder somewhere around here, and the shop owner told me something different, and they issue a penalty because you haven't adequately trained the employees on where to get those data sheets.
Is there an SDS binder like the old MDSD binder?
You can definitely make a binder with the new safety data sheets. A lot of shops are going to do that. A lot of shops are going to lean on the paint manufacturers and jobbers to help them do that. If you want to track your chemicals with a binder, you can do that. I would just tell you that make sure you have some type of a table of contents, a chemical list. So you have a binder with 200 chemicals in it. Make sure you have a list that's 2 or 3 pages long that lists out every single chemical that's going to be in that binder. Shops have been fined for having the data sheets in a binder but not having any type of an inventory list of what's in that binder.
Anybody else have a question? Good questions.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Brandon. I really appreciate your time today. You did an excellent job. And again, I'll send everybody Brandon's information. And thank you all. And look out for future training opportunities that we'll send to you guys on behalf of Impact Collision Solutions and RDA. Thanks.
Thank you, guys. Take care.